images of a murder scene, a garage, an axe, drag marks.
And the investigation was incredibly thorough. There are hundreds and hundreds of photographs that were taken at the scene because when these two women were found, nobody really knew what happened.
Samuel Smithers spent 26 years on death row before the state finally carried out his execution on October 14th, 2025. In this video, we'll look at the chilling crimes that put him there, his last meal, his final words, and what happened in his final moments. In 1996, if you drove through Plant City, Florida, and saw Samuel Smithers tending to a property's landscaping, you'd see exactly what his community saw. A 45-year-old working man, dependable and ordinary. He attended the local church alongside Marion Whitehurst, the owner of a vacant 27-acre property, who trusted Smithers enough to hand him the keys. As a church deacon, Smithers represented moral authority in his community. He was married, held down a steady job, and on paper, he was the kind of neighbor you'd wave to without a second thought. Here's what makes this case deeply unsettling. Smithers had already shown warning signs that everyone missed or chose to ignore. He had prior criminal history involving arson and multiple encounters with prostitutes. These weren't just youthful mistakes. These were patterns of behavior that revealed something darker beneath the surface. Yet the church community embraced him. Marion Whitehurst gave him access to an isolated property. His wife shared a home with him. The mask of normalcy was so convincing that no one questioned what Samuel Smithers did when he drove away from Plant City and headed toward Tampa. 20 miles west of that quiet property sat Hillsborough Avenue in Tampa, a stretch of road known for street-level prostitution. This was Smithers' hunting ground, and he was no stranger there. The women who worked that avenue knew him as a regular customer, another face in the rotation of men who pulled up looking to pay for sex. But Smithers had developed a specific pattern that set him apart, and it reveals just how calculated his crimes would become. He'd approach women at the luxury motel with an offer, extra money, if they'd go somewhere more private, somewhere isolated. It was a simple proposition, one that appealed to women trying to make more in a single transaction. But some women refused. Their instincts told them something was off about going to an isolated location with this man, and those instincts saved their lives. They're alive today because they said no. But two women, Denise Roach and Christie Cowan, agreed to go with him. That decision would cost them everything. In mid-May of 1996, Smithers picked up Denise Roach from the motel area. She got into his vehicle expecting a straightforward transaction, sex for money, then back to familiar territory. Instead, Smithers drove her east, away from Tampa's streets, away from any witnesses, until they reached that 27-acre property in Plant City. The property where he had keys, the property where he was supposed to be maintaining the landscaping, the property that was isolated enough that no one would hear anything. When they arrived, she was strangled, she was beaten, she was stabbed with a sharp instrument. Medical examiners would document the combination of blunt force trauma and puncture wounds that ended her life. Smithers then dragged her body to one of the ponds on the property, leaving her submerged as if she'd never existed at all. For 7 to 14 days, Denise Roach lay in that pond while Samuel Smithers went about his normal life. He went to work, came home to his wife, and attended church. He punched his time card and maintained his reputation as a reliable, ordinary man. And then he went back to Hillsborough Avenue. On a later date, Smithers encountered Cowan, another victim. When Smithers picked up Christie Cowan from the same motel area, he was repeating a script he'd already perfected. Same hunting ground, same offer of extra money, same isolated property, same locked gate. Christie couldn't have known she was following the exact path Denise Roach had taken less than 2 weeks earlier. She couldn't have known that another woman's body was already in the pond where her own would soon end up. The violence against Christie was even more extreme. Smithers used an axe and a hoe in addition to strangulation. The blunt force trauma was so severe that her face and skull bore the evidence of repeated, deliberate strikes. Just like Denise, she was stabbed with sharp instruments. Just like Denise, her body was dragged to the pond and left there. 2 women, same location, same method, same killer. The pattern wasn't just similar, it was nearly identical. Now here's the moment that should stop you cold. Samuel Smithers returned to that property after the second murder to clean his tools. On May 28, 1996, Marion Whitehurst, the church friend who'd entrusted Smithers with his property, arrived to find Smithers casually cleaning an axe near a pool of blood. When confronted, Smithers offered the weakest possible explanation. It was animal blood, just a small animal he'd dealt with while maintaining the property. Marion Whitehurst's instincts told him otherwise. The amount of blood was too extensive. Smithers' behavior was too strange. Whitehurst made the call to police, and what officers discovered in those ponds confirmed the horrifying truth. 2 bodies, 2 women who'd been missing, 2 brutal murders that had happened in the space of 2 weeks, carried out by a church deacon who was supposed to be mowing grass. Once police pulled those 2 bodies from the ponds, the investigation moved fast. Detectives had a suspect standing right there with a bloody axe and a story about animal blood that nobody believed. But having a suspect and building a case that would hold up in court are 2 very different things. The prosecutors needed evidence, hard, undeniable proof that would connect Samuel Smithers to these murders beyond any reasonable doubt. What they found was overwhelming. DNA evidence directly linked Smithers to both victims, establishing physical contact that he couldn't explain away. His work time card became a crucial piece of the puzzle, confirming the timeline of when he'd left work on the days the women disappeared. Then there was surveillance footage from a convenience store that placed Smithers with one of the victims, captured on camera in those final hours before she vanished. The prostitute community along Hillsborough Avenue provided testimony that painted a damning picture. Multiple women came forward to confirm they knew Smithers as a regular customer. These weren't casual observations. These were women who'd had direct encounters with him, who recognized his face and his vehicle. Some of them had been propositioned with that same offer, extra money to go somewhere isolated. Witnesses confirmed interactions with both Denise Roach and Christie Cowan, establishing that Smithers had been with these women right before they died. Medical examiners presented findings that told the story of what happened in those final moments. The combination of blunt force trauma, strangulation marks, and wounds from sharp instruments painted a picture of sustained, deliberate violence. These weren't quick deaths or accidents that got out of hand. The evidence showed someone who had inflicted multiple forms of trauma on each victim, someone who had the time and privacy to carry out prolonged attacks without interruption. With all this evidence stacking up, detectives brought Smithers in for questioning. What happened in those interrogation rooms would become one of the most revealing aspects of the entire case. Smithers didn't stay silent. He didn't immediately lawyer up and refuse to talk. Instead, he started telling stories, multiple stories actually, each one different from the last. Here's where things get interesting. Smithers gave detectives multiple inconsistent statements, changing details each time he recounted what happened. He'd tell one version, then shift key facts in the next telling. Detectives watched as he tried out different explanations, different justifications, like he was testing which story might work best. It's a pattern you see sometimes with killers who think they can talk their way out of the evidence. They keep adjusting their narrative, not realizing that every inconsistency just makes them look more guilty. Eventually, the weight of everything became too much. Smithers confessed to both murders. Not a vague admission or a partial confession. He provided details about picking up the women, driving them to the property, and killing them. He walked detectives through the sequence of events, confirming what the physical evidence had already told them. Think about what this means. Smithers had every opportunity to remain silent, to force the state to prove every single element of their case without his help. Instead, he talked, he confessed, he gave them the details they needed to solidify their case, whether it was arrogance, guilt, or a belief that he could somehow spin the narrative in his favor. Smithers handed prosecutors exactly what they needed on a silver platter.
We want to make sure, as citizens and as prosecutors, that he has been given every relief to which he is entitled, because a jury unanimously decided that death was the appropriate sentence. And it took a very thorough investigation and just good old detective work, boots on the ground detective work, to get this Deacon of Death, as he's been called, brought into justice.
The investigation had built an ironclad case. The evidence was there. The confession was on record. Now it would be up to a jury to decide his fate, and Smithers would have one more story to tell, one that would be even harder to believe than all the others combined. When Samuel Smithers' trial began in 1999, prosecutors felt confident. They had DNA evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimony, medical examiner reports, and most importantly, Smithers' own detailed confessions to multiple detectives. It seemed like an open and shut case. The defense would need something extraordinary to overcome that mountain of evidence. What they came up with was extraordinary, but not in the way anyone expected. Smithers took the stand and told a completely new story. After confessing multiple times to investigators, after providing specific details about picking up these women and killing them, he now claimed he hadn't done it at all. Instead, he introduced the jury to a mysterious figure he called Mr. X. According to this new version of events, Mr. X was the real killer. Smithers claimed he'd simply been forced to watch these murders happen, powerless to stop them. He testified that Mr. X had threatened him, held him at bay with violence, and warned that his family would be killed if he ever spoke up. The implication was clear. Smithers was a victim too, caught in circumstances beyond his control. The audacity of this defense is almost hard to wrap your mind around. This wasn't a minor detail change or a slight reframing of events. This was a complete reversal of everything Smithers had already admitted to law enforcement. The man who'd confessed in detail was now pointing the finger at a phantom who conveniently couldn't be found or verified. The jury would have to decide which Samuel Smithers to believe, the one who confessed or the one now claiming innocence. Smithers' defense team knew the Mr. X story was a long shot. They needed to give the jury reasons to spare his life, even if they found him guilty. So they shifted focus to his background, presenting mitigating evidence designed to explain, if not excuse, how someone could commit such horrific acts. The defense brought forward testimony about Smithers' childhood abuse, painting a picture of a man shaped by trauma from an early age. They documented head injuries he'd sustained over the years, injuries that could potentially affect behavior and decision-making. Mental health issues were raised, with expert witnesses testifying about possible brain damage and emotional disturbances that might have impaired his judgment. These experts suggested that Smithers wasn't simply evil, he was damaged. They argued that a combination of childhood trauma, physical injuries to the brain, and untreated mental health conditions had created someone who couldn't fully control his actions. It's the kind of defense you see in many capital cases, an attempt to make the jury see the defendant as broken rather than purely malicious. The prosecution wasn't about to let that narrative stand unchallenged. They brought in their own expert witnesses who examined the same evidence and reached very different conclusions. These state experts testified that Smithers was not mentally ill. They found no evidence of brain damage severe enough to explain his actions. Most importantly, they argued that whatever difficulties Smithers may have faced in his past, he demonstrated a clear capacity to understand right from wrong. The state's experts pointed to the calculated nature of the crimes. Smithers had targeted vulnerable women in a specific location. He'd lured them to an isolated property where he had privacy and control. He'd repeated the pattern with a second victim. He'd attempted to hide the bodies. These weren't the actions of someone whose mental state prevented him from understanding his behavior. These were the deliberate choices of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and tried to get away with it. When deliberations ended, the jury's message was unambiguous: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. They hadn't bought the Mr. X defense. They'd weighed the mitigating evidence about Smither's background and found it insufficient to excuse what he'd done. The confessions, the physical evidence, and the testimony of witnesses who knew Smithers as a regular customer in that area all pointed to the same conclusion. Samuel Smithers was responsible for these murders, but being found guilty was only the first decision. Florida law requires a separate penalty phase where the jury recommends whether the defendant should receive life in prison or death. Given the brutality of the crimes and the lack of genuine remorse, remember, Smithers had blamed Mr. X instead of taking responsibility. The jury's recommendation came back unanimous: death. Judge William Fuente had the final say. In capital cases, judges can technically override a jury's recommendation, though it's rare. Judge Fuente reviewed all the evidence, considered the aggravating and mitigating factors, and issued his ruling. The aggravating factors were substantial. First, the murders were determined to be heinous, atrocious, and cruel, legal terms that apply when victims suffer conscious physical torture or extreme violence. The evidence of prolonged beatings, strangulation, and stabbing certainly met that threshold. Second, the crimes were cold, calculated, and premeditated. Smithers had targeted these women deliberately, taken them to a location he'd prepared, and carried out planned attacks. There was no moral or legal justification for any of it. Third, and critically important, Smithers had committed 2 murders. In legal terms, each murder served as a prior violent felony for the other, an aggravating factor that carries enormous weight in capital sentencing. When someone kills multiple victims, it demonstrates a pattern that makes them particularly dangerous. Judge Fuente weighed these aggravating factors against the mitigating evidence about Smithers' troubled background. In June 1999, he handed down the sentence, death by lethal injection. Samuel Smithers would be transferred to Florida's death row, beginning what would become a 26-year wait for his execution date. The man who'd stood in that courtroom at age 45, trying to blame a phantom named Mr. X for murders he'd already confessed to, would grow old behind bars. Appeals would be filed, motions would be argued, but the sentence would stand, and eventually the state of Florida would come to collect on that judgment. When Samuel Smithers arrived on Florida's death row in June 1999, he was 45 years old. Most people sentenced to death don't spend decades waiting for their execution, but Smithers would. For the next 26 years, he'd be confined to a 6 by 9 foot cell, existing in the limbo between a death sentence and its fulfillment. During those years, Smithers' legal team filed appeal after appeal. They challenged the conviction on multiple grounds, arguing everything from ineffective counsel to improper jury instructions. Post-conviction motions followed, each one claiming some procedural error or constitutional violation that warranted overturning the sentence. It's what happens in every capital case. The system requires exhaustive review because death is irreversible. Every single appeal was denied. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed the case repeatedly and found no reversible error. Federal courts examined the constitutional claims and found them without merit. Year after year, the answer came back the same. The conviction and sentence would stand. Samuel Smithers had been given a fair trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury's recommendation of death was appropriate, given the heinous nature of his crimes. As the years stretched on, something changed. Smithers aged. The 45-year-old man who'd stood trial in 1999 became a 50-year-old, then 60, then 70. By 2025, he was 72 years old, dealing with the physical and mental decline that comes with advanced age. His legal team saw an opening for one last argument, one that had never been tried before in his case. In September 2025, Smither's attorneys filed what they called a final constitutional challenge. The argument was bold and unprecedented in his case. Executing someone at 72 years old constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. They weren't claiming he was innocent. They weren't even claiming the trial was unfair. Instead, they argued that executing an elderly person, regardless of their crimes, violates contemporary standards of decency. The statistics they presented were striking. Since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, only 16 people over the age of 70 had been executed in the entire United States. 16 people out of more than 1,600 total executions. That's just about 1%. The defense argued that this rarity proved society had evolved beyond executing the elderly, that it had become so unusual that continuing the practice violated constitutional protections. Their reasoning went deeper than just numbers. The death penalty is supposed to serve two purposes: deterrence and retribution. Deterrence means preventing future crimes by showing potential offenders the consequences. Retribution means giving victims and society a sense that justice has been served. But after 26 years, with Smithers now a frail 72-year-old man, did the execution still serve either purpose? The defense argued it didn't. Who's being deterred by executing someone 3 decades after their crime? What retributive value remains when the person being executed is so physically and mentally different from the person who committed the murders? At some point, they claimed, punishment stops being justice and becomes nothing more than state-sanctioned revenge against an elderly individual who no longer poses any threat. The Florida Supreme Court wasn't persuaded. On September 22, 2025, they denied the motion, calling it procedurally barred, meaning it should have been raised earlier in the appeals process. More importantly, they found that U.S. Supreme Court precedent didn't support the claim. The High Court has ruled that executing juveniles is unconstitutional because their brains aren't fully developed. It has ruled that executing the intellectually disabled is unconstitutional because they can't fully appreciate the consequences of their actions. But it has never ruled that advanced age alone makes someone ineligible for execution. Judge Michelle Cisco, writing for the court, made the state's position clear. Advanced age doesn't diminish the retributive value of the death penalty. The heinousness of the crimes remains unchanged regardless of how much time has passed. Denise Roach and Christie Cowan are still dead. Their families still suffered. The fact that Smithers managed to survive on death row for 26 years doesn't erase what he did or make him less deserving of the sentence a jury unanimously recommended. 8 days before that ruling, on September 13, 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis had already made his decision. He signed a death warrant setting Smithers' execution for October 14, 2025. That date would make Smithers the 14th person executed in Florida in 2025 alone. For Smithers, the constitutional arguments about age and cruelty had failed. The courts had spoken. The governor had signed the warrant. After 26 years of legal battles, appeals, and delays, the state of Florida was ready to carry out the sentence handed down in 1999. Samuel Smithers had 1 month left to live. October 14th, 2025. After 26 years on death row, after countless appeals and legal motions, after one last constitutional challenge based on his age, Samuel Smithers' final day had arrived. The final day on death row follows a careful protocol. Smithers would have been moved to a holding cell closer to the execution chamber. Prison officials would have conducted their final checks, ensuring everything was prepared for the procedure. Smithers had 2 final rights afforded to every condemned prisoner: a last meal and a last statement. For his last meal, Smithers requested fried chicken and fried fish, along with apple pie and ice cream. He awoke at 6:30 a.m. that morning, remained compliant with prison officials, and chose not to meet with any spiritual advisor or accept visitors during his final hours. When the curtain went up at 6 p.m., Smithers was already strapped to the gurney with an IV in his arm. The warden asked if he had any final statement. After 26 years on death row, Smithers' response was brief. No, sir. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the families who'd waited nearly 3 decades. Just 2 words. Then silence. At 6 p.m., Samuel Smithers was escorted into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. The room is small and clinical, with a gurney in the center and witnesses viewing through glass windows. Smithers was strapped down, arms extended. Technicians inserted IV lines for the 3-drug lethal injection protocol. The warden read the death warrant one final time. After any last words were spoken, the procedure began. The first drug rendered him unconscious. The second stopped his breathing. The third stopped his heart. Within minutes, a physician checked for vital signs and found none. Samuel Smithers was pronounced dead. With that pronouncement, Smithers became the 17th person over 70 executed in the United States since 1976. 17 out of more than 1,600 executions over nearly 5 decades. Executing someone at 72 is extraordinarily rare, representing a tiny fraction of all capital punishments in modern America. Here's what makes it even more unusual. Smithers wasn't elderly when he committed his crimes. He was 45. The 27-year gap between sentencing and execution wasn't intentional. It was simply how long the appeals process took. In a strange way, the very slowness of the death penalty system had created the constitutional question his lawyers tried to use to save his life. Florida had carried out its 14th execution of 2025, setting a modern record under Governor DeSantis. For some, this represented justice finally served, clearing a backlog where appeals had been exhausted. For others, it raised questions about whether executing elderly inmates served any purpose beyond retribution. The legal system had reviewed Smitther's case thoroughly over 26 years. Multiple courts examined his claims and found them without merit. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA, confessions, witnesses, physical proof. The brutality was undeniable. A jury unanimously recommended death, and a judge agreed. Samuel Smithers, the church deacon who'd hidden behind respectability, who'd preyed on vulnerable women and murdered them on isolated property, who'd blamed a phantom, Mr. X, rather than take responsibility, was gone. The Deacon of Death had met the fate prescribed by Florida law nearly 3 decades earlier. Christie Cowan and Denise Roach never got to grow old. They never got 26 extra years or even 26 extra days. Their lives ended violently in spring 1996, their bodies left in ponds like trash to be disposed of. Whatever one thinks about the death penalty or executing elderly inmates, those 2 women deserve to be remembered as more than statistics in a legal debate. Their families waited 29 years for this day. Justice, when it finally arrives after nearly 3 decades, rarely brings the peace people imagine, but it had arrived nonetheless. On October 14th, 2025, the state of Florida carried out the sentence handed down in 1999. One of America's rarest executions, an elderly man paying for crimes committed in his middle age, was complete. The case of the Deacon of Death was finally closed. So what do you think about this case? Should someone who spent 26 years on death row and reached 72 years old still face execution? Or does justice require carrying out the sentence regardless of how much time has passed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear different perspectives on this. And if you found this case as compelling as I did, hit that like button and share this video with someone who's interested in true crime and the complexities of the justice system. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.